Greetings, everybody. Stephen Gray here again, and you are watching the Stephen Gray YouTube channel, or perhaps listening to this on Anchor.fm, that's ANCHOR, or one of its spin-offs on iTunes, Spotify, etc. The purpose of these, if you have not visited us before, is to share information and inspiration on the essential consciousness transformation process that absolutely needs to happen on this planet. We are increasingly heading into challenging times. We need waking up. We need a lot of waking up, and that's what these are all about, to try to help people get it on a variety of levels, with a focus on the psychedelics, but not always the psychedelics, because again, the overarching mission is consciousness transformation on the planet, saving the planet for sustainable and sane ways for the generations to come. So continuing on in that way, we have a very interesting fellow today. I have a very interesting fellow to speak with today, whose name is Chris Becker. He's a scientist, inventor, and author. He holds a PhD in chemistry from UC Berkeley, and was a postdoctoral associate at MIT in chemistry and physics. Chris is author on 130 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles and 20 US patents. He's managed laboratories and research groups and co-founded 2 companies. Blending science and spirituality, Chris has practiced Buddhist meditation for many years. His 2020 book, Healing with Psychedelics, describes how he transformed his life with the help of psychedelics in carefully designed therapeutic conditions. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me.
Oh, not at all. It's very interesting. You know, this is, as you know, Chris, you don't need me to tell you, psychedelic psychotherapy, guiding, etc., is becoming increasingly common. And so it's a very important topic. It needs to be understood, the causes, the ways that it can help, and the practice and the ethics as well, of course.
All right.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Carry on.
Well, yeah, it's certainly a really important topic, and wonderful that it is growing in popularity, but just the information that people are becoming aware of it. In fact, it's part of that growing awareness that brought me to it too. So, but it's wonderful that more and more people are becoming aware of the value that it can bring for healing, the troubles that most of us suffer in life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. It's a blessing. It really is. You know, after, as I'm sure you know, went through 30 years of darkness, you might say. With all research being shut down and so on and so on. And thankfully, it seems like we're getting past that. There's still a lot of, stigma or ignorance involved, but it's exploding. And yeah, so obviously a very important topic. But let's get into talking about your situation and, why you wrote this book and so on. So let me ask you, your field didn't necessarily point you in that direction automatically as a PhD chemical physicist. So what got you into, what led to this book?
Right. Well, that's a kind of a big question, because it's like kind of a life journey thing, but I'll try to make it very simple. And that is, although I was very much a functioning person in society, with a PhD and productive scientist, I came to this field, this area, as a client. And and also I came to it as a client in a way that most people come to therapy in general. They have some wake-up call or some big bump in their life. A lot of times it's separation or divorce, or somebody dies and a loved one dies or gets ill, or car crash, or just a really intense depression or anxiety. In my case, it was addiction. And my wife and brother had a chance dinner together. She was out of town where he was living, and they had dinner together. And they were talking about me, and said, he's really got a drinking problem. And also, as an aside, I would say cannabis, but at that time, but drinking was certainly foremost in their minds, I was drinking about a bottle of wine each night, and functioning, doing my day job, but clearly numbing myself out. And so they said, really, they asked me to stop, and they put some heavy pressure on me to stop. So that's really what got me in this area. And just fortunately, you talked about the growth in the area. Just by coincidence, I had read Michael Pollan's book just a couple months before this, his How to Change Your Mind, which is a lovely book. He doesn't really get too much into psychotherapy in that book, but still, it's a great book, though. And so I'd read it, and it made, and my brother and wife were saying, well, you got to have you got to have a plan. You can't just expect to stop and everything's going to be great. You got to have a plan. And so I thought about it and went on the internet, researched what you can do, and I kept thinking about Michael Pollan's book, and thought, well, why not try psychedelic assisted therapy? So I got back on the internet and Googled around, and I found a local psychotherapist who was clearly knowledgeable in this field. And he had spent actually 2 years in Peru as an assistant in a ayahuasca retreat center. But he didn't do that work locally. He had a license and didn't want to jeopardize his license. Correct. So I got a hold of him. I liked his website. I liked what he had to say in an essay he wrote. And then so I went and visited him, and he slowed me down a bit, said, because I came in there, oh, let's do some psychedelic therapy, and what do I know? And he said, well, let's slow down. Let's kind of take our time, just do some talk therapy for a while, kind of plow the ground. Let's understand what's really going on for you. And so we did that for a few months. And then he said, well, okay, I think you're ready. And then he referred me to somebody who was working underground in the area. And that's where I continued on that therapeutic route. So that's kind of a long way to say it was my own personal pain and my addiction, which is self-medication, to deal with that pain, that brought me to where I am today, and as a client, but also because of the scientist background and because of a meditation background, I thought I might be in a good position to say some things that might be useful for people who are thinking about it or wonder about the pain that they suffer in their lives, and give them some encouragement. So that's why I'm here today.
Yes, good. So in the book, you've spoken a lot about childhood trauma, which I assume you experienced, and also have some thoughts about what kind of the causes are and how childhood trauma manifests in adult life, that kind of thing. So maybe I gather that when you went through your course of treatment, you started to see where your own childhood trauma was. So maybe we start there. Can you talk about that? Spill the beans, as it were?
Yeah. In my personal case, I suffered from really infant abandonment by my mother for a month or so. And also
at that point then?
Pardon me?
Where was your father at that point?
Oh, he was there. He was there, but he wasn't really much of a caregiver. So they brought in. So what happened in my case was that my people talk about viruses. My brother, my older brother, contracted polio, and he got pretty sick with the polio. Partially paralyzed him. And my mother took him to a treatment center that was out of state. And that was, and stayed there for a month or a little more for his treatment. And this is when I was 9 months old, which is really at a crucial, for people who know child psychology development, a really crucial time in attachment. So it's very big attachment trauma. which was pre-verbal, which I visited in a journey, but that's only part of my particular trauma that kind of set it off. But basically, my parents were not very nurturing. They were, even, past that, they just were not affectionate. My mother, I have no memories of sitting on my mother's lap, for example. She just was not she wasn't the one to come and hug you and kiss you. And so it was a kind of a lonely and very desolate childhood in my case. So that's pretty severe developmental trauma that I suffered, unfortunately. And that's to answer your question in my personal case. That was kind of wraps it up.
So, and then at what age did you start seriously abusing alcohol? And could you, having gone through your treatment protocol now, when you look back at that,
Mm-hmm.
it may be kind of obvious to ask or say, but are you aware of what it was you were trying to stuff down? Was it just, you were just hurting from lack of nurturing, or do you have any kind of specific, sense of what it was you were avoiding, as it were?
At that time, and I would say, as I review that, especially beginning as it began, the addiction began, which would be in teenage years, really, and doing things that a lot of teenagers do, but maybe I was a little bit more interested in them than most teenagers. For example, getting drunk, finding some alcohol, even pre legal age. And then discovering marijuana, those kind of ages, like late high school ages or so. And more, I think in retrospect, more than most of my peers, being more and more, we got to find this, we got to get this, we got to use this. And so even it manifested in those times. And then slowly, and then as I became, an adult and on my own, marijuana and alcohol were common. Like usually daily, and slowly grew. Maybe the alcohol slowly grew over the last 20 years of it all, but it was pretty constant. Those two substances as self-medication were there. But as far as my understanding why I was doing it, no, I was pretty much in the dark, as most people are. Maybe you have a vague idea that something's not right, but in my case, and in many people's cases, no clear understanding of what's driving the behavior, the need to find the substance.
Yeah. This is kind of a sidebar that I don't want to, go down this rabbit hole for, any very much of our time here, but just out of curiosity, my mother was also an alcoholic, and I heard it said that typically, and my mother was one of those people, alcoholics, until they finally do something about it, don't even realize they are alcoholics. Were you aware that would you have labeled yourself an alcoholic for much of that time?
Good question. Not sure how accurate I can answer, but probably not. I mean, I knew that, especially, I knew I had an issue. Let me put it that way. A drinking issue. I wouldn't have used that label for myself because I was functioning. I went to work. I was, I got things done. I was always sober during the daytime. So I probably wouldn't have used that label, although it would have been appropriate. Mm-hmm. But I did know something. I did know I had an issue.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about childhood trauma, because you've focused on that, and I gather you have things you want to share about the nature of it, how it manifests in adult life, how difficult it is to treat, that kind of thing. Can you just kind of free ramble about that a bit?
Yes. Well, childhood trauma, or maybe better called developmental trauma. First of all, for people who don't already know, it's extremely common, very common in our population, probably easily the majority of the people listening to this podcast or any podcast have suffered some significant level of developmental trauma. And it takes all shapes and forms how it happens. And actually, and there's quite a lot of research, psychological research on the area. So, and in the book, I mentioned a study that is a very famous, now pretty famous study, the ACE study, ACE acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it was done initially by Kaiser, a researcher, in conjunction with the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, famous CDC people talk about now with regard to the pandemic. And actually on the CDC website, there's a lot of information about childhood trauma. And there's a questionnaire, for example, I reproduce it in the book, but you can find it online. It has 10 questions. I think it's 10 questions. Common things like, did anybody hit you, spank you, throw something at you when you were a child? Or were you just neglected? Did your parents argue a lot? And maybe was there any violence toward your mother or female caregiver in the house? Was there any suicide or suicide attempts in the family? There's a range of these 10 questions, which are really good 10 questions. And you can get a score on that questionnaire, and people often use it when they bring in patients, when patients show up in therapeutic situations. But it's also important to mention that not everything is captured on that questionnaire. There can be very subtle things like behavior modification, where children learn that if you don't behave right, quite right, you don't get the love. So you actually have to modify your behavior and become really somebody else. So your true self becomes kind of obscured behind these behavioral patterns. Some people, as a metaphor, you could call it a mask or a suit of armor that keeps us really from being ourselves out in the world. So anyway, developmental trauma is very common, and it can be horrific, huge beatings and starvation, but it can be very subtle too. And the subtle trauma is just as important. People shouldn't say, oh, a lot of people don't really realize, especially before they've been in therapy, what's happened. There's a lot of denial. People, oh yeah, I had a great childhood, or it was an okay childhood. And they don't really realize that they had to become a different person to save themselves, to survive, and to be able to flourish as a person. But yet they've had this injury that they carry around, and it manifests. And most people really take it to the grave. Just because you're 40 or 60 or 80 doesn't mean you aren't really behaving, because in ways that happened when you were 1 or 5 years old.
Yeah, I'd say it's all but universal, really. My old Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, talked about, he used the term mutual group imprisonment, because we're all afraid of egolessness. We're all afraid of waking up, in a sense, letting go of that identity that we put together. And so we don't want, we can't see what others are capable of in that sense. And we don't want them, in a sense, like if somebody's, vibrating at a higher level of, awakening or authenticity, you might say, that's a mirror back to people who are hiding from that. In a sense, we're all playing a game that way, right? We're all to varying degrees hiding from our true nature, as you've called it there. Yeah. And actually, I just thought I'd share. You mentioned Gabor Mate. You're familiar with his work. Mm-hmm. We had him at our conference, the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, a couple of times, and there were about a couple hundred people in the audience. And as you know, he says it's not really the drugs that are the problem; it's the wound or the trauma underneath that, and the behavior that you engage in. And he said, so if we talk about addiction as anything that kind of, in a sense, turns you away from yourself, and then he listed off a few things like workaholism and a number of other things. And he said, by that definition, how many people here would admit to being addicted? And pretty much every hand in the room went up. Right? So I think we all have been shut down to varying degrees or another.
Right. Can I just interject real quick to make sure the audience knows, because you raised a very good point. A lot of people think of addiction as alcohol or drugs, but it's manifested in all sorts of ways. You know, there's eating, there's shopping, there's sex, there's work, there's power, there's fast cars, there's sports, there's yoga. I mean, depends on how you if you use it in a way that is taking you away from yourself in that kind of manner, then it is an addiction. So, I mean, they can be good things. Yoga can be a good thing. A glass of wine at dinner maybe can be a good thing, but you know, how we use them, then it can be other things besides alcohol and drugs.
Of course, yeah. So, as I think you and I would agree, psychedelics are arguably when used properly in the right kinds of therapeutic contexts, etc., arguably, you know, maybe even arguably far and away the most effective techniques for a lot of people for healing. And I think you would probably agree with that based on your own experience. So tell us a little bit about, you found this therapist, underground therapist. Tell us a little bit about what happened with that, and whatever's involved, like such as what medicine you worked with, what was the protocol, whether introductory pre-sessions and all that sort of thing.
Right. So thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and then that's a big topic. Like, how does it work? I mean, how do people do psychedelic therapy? Maybe if it's okay, I want to mention one thing first. That a lot of people, especially young people, they hear about things like we're talking about, and they say, well, maybe I could use some help, and they want to do it themselves. So they have a kind of a do-it-yourself thing, and they say, well, I can go get some mushrooms from my friend or whatever, and I'll go to the beach or in my room, whatever, and I'll do this work myself. And I want to say that I'd like to discourage that. I mean, I don't want to say that it isn't possible to have healing experiences that way. Certainly, everything's possible. But it's also very easy to harm yourself and also kind of go sideways. And people do it yourself a lot of times because of shame. It takes a lot of courage to walk into the room with a therapist and admit that you have a problem. And so I just want to acknowledge that and encourage people to be courageous, because it's your life, and take that step. And so that's one of the first things about psychedelic assisted therapy. It's not just psychedelics. And a lot of people also in our culture, we have this cultural idea that you take a pill, take a magic pill. You can see advertisements on TV all the time. Take this thing for that and this for that. And so we have this kind of mindset that we've been, brainwashed with, so to speak, that, it's just a pill. And so I think that at the outset, I want to say that the psychedelics are a key. They are medicine, and they're medicine used in a special context. They're not used as a magic pill. They're used in a therapeutic relationship. And so it's very important what that relationship is. One thing to keep in mind is that the injuries that we have suffered happened in relation to people. And that also means that the healing has to happen in relation to people. And so it's really important to have a very strong, trusting, and eventually loving relationship with your therapist as part of the healing process. And so it really is psychotherapy, but the medicines are very strong, and they can do things, open up neural pathways and rewire things. And really, in some way, also, it's good to talk about just opening up the unconscious, because a lot of these injuries and fears reside in our unconscious, and the medicine is very powerful to open those things up. But it needs to be opened in a safe container, and that's what the therapeutic process allows. So to get back to your question more about how it really happened. So I got referred to this underground therapist and my above ground therapist, and then they talked, what's going on with this fellow. And so he had a little background. but still we started just talking, my underground therapist and myself, in my case. So some like a 1 hour session kind of thing. And he's trained therapist. So he got to know me, but also we got an opportunity to establish some trust. I could get comfortable with him and trust him. And then, after a month or so, he said, okay, let's set a date. And so the way we did it is he comes from a tradition. It's somewhat eclectic, but Mexican-oriented tradition, indigenous Mexican tradition, and also some modern psychotherapy tradition, and things that have just developed over the last 50 years underground in this country. So we started with the standard protocol, in my case, which is the first 2 journeys are with MDMA, which is a heart opening substance. It was done with some ritual. We had an altar. There were prayers, put things on the altar, and then with eye shades, so it's introspection. Lay down on a little mattress, and he put some music on. In our case, it was indoors. We had music, and that's how the therapeutic sessions began. A lot of healing in those first 2 MDMA journeys, and then after that, we did some psilocybin mushroom journeys, which are a little bit rougher, people would say.
Right.
They can toss.
Can I interrupt for a sec?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'd just like to hear a bit more from you about MDMA, and when you say healing, can you be a little more specific? Like, what happened in those sessions? Can you give us a little bit of relevant guidance on that score? Right.
So for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, it really opened my emotions. The very first one, I could feel, I could cry, in the right circumstances, and just opened my heart in my emotional self that had been blocked, literally blocked off all those years. And that in itself was very healing. It was like it blew the doors off of my emotions. It just totally transformed my ability to feel and express my emotions. And that's just a huge thing. And there were some things about the family that were healing, but it was the second MDMA journey where I did a lot of the early childhood visitation, with my guide to review, kind of like people talk about the missing experience, the therapeutic missing experience. So you go back to the experience that was traumatic, that was hurtful. And sometimes it can be years of neglect. It doesn't have to be like this happened this day, but it could be a thing that happened one day. In anybody's case, in mine, there's a mixture of it. There's a lot of just general neglect. There were some instances of where I felt like I was really hurt, and a few times I wasn't beaten a lot, but there were some physical things, yelling, sometimes yelling can be very scary to a kid, because and threatening of abandonment. I went to a couple of those places, because to a child, that's like, maybe I'll kill you. That's what it means to a child. So those are very traumatic experiences. But I did that under the medicine, so I could approach it in a way that it was approachable, and visit it, but with also the support of my guide, who could reassure me that, he was there, and that he understood, and so that it's just the context of being with another person who was loving and supportive, while it lowered the barrier, but also opened up the mind and the heart in a way that you could visit these places. And
Yeah.
that's how the healing takes place.
Yeah, I'm familiar with MDMA from personal experience. When it's clean, it's good, pure. That's a whole other topic. And you've taken it in the right circumstances with the right kind of intention. It's a beautiful medicine. It really is.
Yeah.
So I don't want to. I want to keep us moving along toward your, the rest of your journey here. But I hope that you will help me remember if I don't later. I want to ask you. I don't want to distract you right now, but I want to ask you more about the what would you call it, the qualifications to be a good guide, because that's a really important topic, and there's a lot more being said about that. As you know, Francois Bouzon talks about it. Up here in Canada, we have MAPS Canada. Mark Hayden, who's the executive director, has put out a book of a manual of guides and so on. But anyway, maybe we could. It's up to you if you think if you want to take that sort of side.
Yeah, we'll take it.
Yeah.
We can take it now. That's really important from my perspective in learning about these people. And I've met some other people and talked to them about their training. And of course, I know my guide's training. He happened to be very experienced, but not everybody is so experienced. But I would say to people who are interested in this area and looking for healing, that the guide should be well-trained. And well-trained means probably a minimum of 2 years of training. This is not like you're going to go down to Peru for 2 weeks and you're a shaman. This is something where you're really trained in some psychotherapy, in some ways, some schools of thought, and also trained with the medicine, understanding how to work with the medicine, how to work with people who are under the medicine. So I would say if people should not be shy. If a person's investigating and they come into contact with someone and they want to know, is this the right person? Well, of course, there's always a gut feeling about the person. You should trust that first if you don't feel comfortable with the person. But that you should ask them about their training. And I would say that if they don't have at least a couple of years training, you should find somebody else. So hope that answered your question?
Yeah, there's a lot more we could talk about, but maybe it's more aimed at people who want to be guides themselves. This book by Mark Hayden, as I was mentioning, there's 100 pages of guidance for therapists that do this kind of work. Ways to be in the session and that sort of thing, ethics, all that kind of stuff. Oh, go ahead.
Well, there are. I should mention that there are schools, actually organized schools to teach this. I'm sure there will be more in time, but there's a couple I know of in the Bay Area that teach this kind of skill. So hopefully it's not. It'd be great. The book is good that you mentioned, but somebody who sits down and reads 100 pages doesn't become qualified to do this, right? There's a lot of training involved and experience that you need to acquire to be qualified.
Sure. So coming out of your 3 MDMA sessions, the next one was a session or more, was it, with psilocybin? What happened there?
Well, psilocybin allows for more growth and healing. It's a little bit rougher. That's why they don't usually, in this school of thought that my guide belongs to, that community, they don't start there usually. But it can open up some things that MDMA might not be able to open up. And so it's a little bit rougher. It kind of tosses you around a little bit. That's why I came up with a name for it in my book. I called it the Celestial Washing Machine. So it's like, sometimes you're in the agitator and it can be a little bit vigorous, but it's all for the good. It takes you where you need to go. It finds those places in some way. The medicine has some knowledge, some earth medicine knowledge. It will take you to those sometimes hidden places in our psyche that need to be explored, that need to be raised into consciousness level. So there's a lot of power in that medicine. And so I've done quite a few after that, but the first couple were the ones where I could have stopped if I wanted to, but it was more just to, as I've done some more for, continued growth. There's always a little more you can heal. There's always more you can grow spiritually. So, but I think primarily the key trauma healing took place over the first couple MDMA and the first couple of maybe 3 or so mushroom journeys I took. So it's a stronger medicine in some ways. Of course, it's dose dependent, but it will tend to reveal things that can be very important that otherwise is really hard to get to.
So in your case, the psilocybin journeys took you to places that the MDMA did not, in terms of your childhood and so on?
Right. And connections too, and connections of my behavior and connections of different life experiences to that early childhood. How, just as an example, how my early relationship to my father connected to my interest in spirituality and Zen masters, Zen teachers, and what that relationship, how that was kind of convoluted in a way that was not healthy, really. And so there was different aspects an example that healed me, both from the childhood and how I felt about my father and how my father was a kind of scary figure for me. And also my understanding of how, but still you want something from your father. And so how I was looking for that from some Zen teachers. And it revealed it in a way that, I don't know how it would have happened otherwise, but it happened in a mushroom journey. So it not just shows you things, and it can do that. It can actually show you events that you didn't realize, but it also can make some connections that you might not have otherwise made.
No, that's fascinating. I think there must be a lot of really poor fathering around because there are a lot of people that are looking for replacement fathers, in delusional, manipulative political figures, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Or not to discuss in this particular interview.
Right.
You may know one in particular that has been particularly egregious that way and yet deluded so many people because they've needed the sort of daddy figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
I understand. I actually was kind of the same way myself as you. I was, what would you call it, idealistically or naively attracted to strong male figures like Buddhist teachers and so on. And as Freud would put it, transferred my own empowerment onto those people, put them above me in that sense, which is a way of disempowering yourself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. So, let's get into a little bit about integration then, because just having these cathartic experiences isn't enough in itself, is it?
Right. And so it's probably obvious to most of your viewers, but I'll just say a quick word about it. Starts with intentions before the journey, really setting those. You're working with your therapist. What do you want to work on? For me personally, what I do is I write it down, especially a week or two before, and then I edit it over the whole week. I'm thinking about it. I'm editing my list, and then the day of the journey, I bring it on a piece of paper and put it on the altar. So that's actually a beginning of the integration. You're really working with the material. What's important to me? What do I want to get from this journey? And then bringing it into the journey. And so it really does connect with after the journey. Of course, the journey brings up things you can't expect and you can't anticipate. And so the integration afterwards is so important because otherwise it can be like, I remember that experience and, that was cool, but, it doesn't really become part of your life. So the integration is really critical to make it what you've learned, what you've experienced, what you've healed, to make it a part of your daily life. And so there are, of course, obvious things that are really important. You have multiple conversations with your therapist, your guide, about what I learned, what I experienced, what it meant. How do you feel about it? How do you go in your body? Where do you feel this? And really do some therapeutic work. So that's part of the integration. In addition, there's all kinds of activities you can do, and it depends on the person and the experience. For me, writing was a good one. I did a lot of writing. Of course, the book kind of came out of that, but it was good. And it was natural for me to do writing. I wrote a letter to my father, for example, that's in the book, as just one little example of an integration exercise. I drew pictures, also some art. Some people do a lot of drawing, singing, dancing, meditations that are really in context to their journey. Any activities that really kind of resonate and reinforce the experience and the healing and the learning are integration. But it's really, and this should be, you should talk, of course, to your therapist about this. What else you want to do? Do I want to sing? And maybe he'll ask you to sing a little bit for him. These kind of things, and really to make the connection stronger. And so that's the integration process, which can last not just days, but it can be weeks or even years. It can become part of your life. Some of the things you do and some of the things you do your whole life.
Oh, I would say so, yeah. And for you, meditation has been an important part of that grounding and continuity, right? So let me ask you, I've had a lot of experience with meditation, but maybe people watching or listening to this have different understandings or not much understanding about what meditation is. How are you using the term, and how did it come into your integration process?
Right. Well, I'm a long-term meditator, and mostly Zazen style. Certainly when I did my early meditation, and I think the meditation helps calm you, and but it's very easy. So there's some good things about meditation, and there's spiritual bypassing, which I'm sure you're familiar with that term, and we could probably spend some time talking about that. And actually, that's what I was doing in a lot of ways. One part of my bypassing was with alcohol or cannabis. Another part of my bypassing was with meditation, in a certain sense. Even though it did some good things, slowed me down, calmed me down a bit. There was a lot of that meditation was up there in the thinking mind, and which probably wasn't that helpful. I think it was helpful, though, in the journeys. I think for some people, it probably, the journeys can be a little bit scary sometimes. They're strong. A lot of things are happening, but I think the meditation can kind of center you a little bit more than might somebody who hasn't had that experience. But in particular, and so the meditation has been good, but actually the journeys and the medicine work has improved my meditation. I feel it's much more open and more relaxed, and I have sometimes beautiful visions, if you will, but also just the feeling and seeing emotions come and go, and thoughts come and go, and body sensations that I feel much more in touch with and much more relaxed with. And I think I'm much more relaxed with other people. I think it manifests not just when you're sitting, but in just daily mindfulness, paying attention to, the classic examples, how you wash the dishes, just doing things like that, how you really pay attention to the dishes and the soap and the temperature of the water and things like that. So I think the meditation helped the medicine work. And I think also the medicine work helped the meditation. So it's kind of an interesting connection in that way. I don't think, I want to be clear, I don't think that you have to do medicine work to grow and heal. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. It's easy to get bypassed. I think it's it could be tricky to find what's really hidden down below. There's many examples of Buddhist teachers, well, in any religion, not just Buddhist teachers, who you would think are very spiritual, very developed in that way, who maybe abuse alcohol, abuse sexually other people, abuse power. And those are people that haven't really, in my opinion, healed. They haven't found, first of all, and then healed their childhood trauma. So it can easily, people talk about living from the neck up. It can happen. So it's just something to be aware of and to be careful about.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I find I'm particularly curious and interested, not that I have any answers, about what appears to be a juxtaposition or a conflict, if you could say, between some of that kind of behavior. A lot of it came out in the 80s with the Buddhist teachers in America. I remember 80s and 90s perhaps. And yet some of them, and I would definitely say this about my old teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, because he's probably one of the kind of people you're talking about. He did abuse alcohol. That's some people's description of it. He said he was using alcohol to ground himself so that he could be sort of at the same level of his students and be able to work with them that way, in a different way. He was definitely tuned into a whole other realms of things, and he definitely understood egolessness on some level, and yet he probably did have some unresolved material. He was taken from his home. He was recognized as the 11th Trungpa Tulku in a pretty elaborate way that I won't take time to go into here in Eastern Tibet, and taken to the monastery to continue the studies, as the 11th in that lineage, reincarnated Lama. And so from the age of 3 until 19, his mother was allowed to visit him and so on. But basically, he was turfed into this, really intense world at the age of 3. And I could imagine that he didn't get the kind of nurturing that, he might have needed in the ways that you talked about that you didn't get, for example, So who knows about all that? Anyway, enough on that one. Well, I think we're kind of coming close to the end, but you wanted to say a little bit more about spiritual bypassing, didn't you?
Well, I think it's a good topic. We've talked about it a little bit, but I want people to be, who aren't already familiar, who are interested in meditation, or maybe they're meditators already, to know that it's a danger, and to know that there can be, in my case, to speak what I really know best, in my case, I think I'm doing everything kind of right, but really, I have these symptoms. And I think that's maybe the best way to go at it, because the symptoms don't lie, and they are the manifestations. And so that trauma may be hidden, but the symptoms kind of leak out. In my case, alcohol or cannabis could be eating or shopping or sex. They got to have a lot of sex or a certain kind of sex. They got to raise to the top of their corporate ladder. They have to, whatever. It can take all kinds of manifestations. If they look closely at themselves, let's talk about the meditators who are listening. They look closely at themselves and just slow down. Do I have anything that's kind of symptomatic like I've just described? If they do, then let's just be gentle with themselves. It's okay. You're not, we tend to be, hard to love ourselves. We tend to look at ourselves as defective, not good enough. And that's the trauma speaking. But just remember to try your best to practice that loving kindness to yourself and say, well, I probably have some old wounds here. And maybe I don't understand them. It's okay. I don't have to understand them right now. But maybe I have some old wounds here, but I want to grow spiritually, but I want to grow really as a complete whole human being. And so that's where it'd be good to get in touch with somebody who does this kind of psychedelic assisted therapy or some kind of therapy or work that can broaden you and open up some parts It isn't just like the spiritual direction. So sometimes people talk about vertical, but then also there's the horizontal. And so the whole person, and the symptoms may be the key, the way to open that door, to see that there's something that needs attention.
Mm-hmm. So just to make sure that if people watching or listening to this aren't familiar with the term spiritual bypassing, as I understand it, it's kind of self-evident using the word bypassing, but it means it's a pretty common phenomenon of ignoring or just kind of bypassing, in that sense, anything that is unresolved, right? And yeah, just to be really clear on that. And, you probably know, well, I do, certainly being around the psychedelic community, that there's a lot of it in the psychedelic community too. In fact, it can be even more pernicious in a sense, because people are having these, Satori type experiences, these, breakthroughs or connection to the divine or whatever, and I think it's easy to delude oneself that, that there isn't more wounded material in there to deal with.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's really an important point. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're about done from my point of view. Excuse me. Do you have anything else that you feel like I didn't get to? I didn't ask you all the questions that we talked about, or I'll be honest, you sent me some, and I kind of weaved in and out of them more or less as I ask you questions here. I hope you've got your message across as much as one can in an hour, but if you feel like we missed anything, last chance.
Well, first, thank you, Stephen, for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the people in your podcast. Mention my website if people want to learn more. Also, there's a blog I have where I write some more essays, the free essays that people, if they like it, they can pick them up for free. It's my website's chrisbecker.org. So pretty simple website.
Mm-hmm.
And
Becker, I'll put it on a title for the YouTube, but for people on Anchor, they're only hearing it. It says Chris Becker, BECKER.org. And your blog is accessible there as well.
Right.
Yeah. And it's an interesting book. I would recommend it, especially for people that, obviously for people that are either in the process or considering the process of psychedelic psychotherapy or guided therapy and that sort of thing. There's another topic that's not part of your agenda. It didn't come up in the book at all, and I don't think there's an answer for it, but I just want to bring it up anyway. As you talked about this over the course of our last hour together, a couple of times what came up in my mind was, you've had the good fortune, if you want to call it that, of having reasonable economic stability. You could afford to do what I imagine was a pretty expensive process, where you had several pre-sessions, a number of guided sessions with both MDMA and psilocybin, and then integration sessions and so on. Mm-hmm. I don't want to ask you exactly how much that cost, but I guess it was multiple thousands of dollars. And that is something that's out of reach for a huge number of people. And I don't even know what the question there is, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we can make this kind of therapy more accessible to more people.
Yeah, excellent question, and important from a community point of view. The first easy kind of answer is that a lot of these people will have a sliding scale, but that doesn't mean it slides low enough to make it particularly affordable. But most people, I think, that I know will have a sliding scale. And they'll talk to you about it. You can talk to them about it, and just be honest with you. This is what I can afford. And if they can't help you, then maybe they'll suggest another way. It does cost money, but I would also say it's a really, if you can afford it, even though it's a stretch and uncomfortable, this is your life. This is really important. It's worth spending some resources on if you possibly can. So but there's still issues there. I would just be in touch with people in the community and ask them, this is my bank account, whatever. This is my, this is my paycheck. This is, how can we work this out?
Yeah.
And a lot of people, because they want to help people, there's usually a solution.
Good. Yeah, well, the idealistic part of my brain, or my soul, so to speak, envisions a time which, hopefully will arrive. Maybe it's 20, 30 years in the future, where these kinds of therapies are supported by medical systems, where there's insurance for them and so on. And it's kind of, on some level, when you think of it from a panoramic point of view, so to speak, the fact that medical doctors, MDs, are the, more or less the only ones that you get to go to and have it covered. Well, I'm talking about Canada, where it's covered for everybody, different situations in different countries. But here in Canada, for example, I can go, it doesn't cost me a penny well, in fact, in my province, there isn't even a yearly fee anymore for it. There used to be about $500 or $600, which is peanuts compared to having to pay for these services themselves. It comes out of your taxes, of course, but nonetheless, for a particular problem, I can go to my doctor and I don't pay out of pocket, period. But the fact that it's only doctors, and with a little bit, you can certainly, insurance programs allow you, some chiropractor visits and so on like that. But, when we really mature, I think we'll have support for psychedelic therapy. It just seems it would be so helpful, right?
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to that, Stephen. And that's a lot of the symptoms of developmental trauma and other traumas, childhood traumas, are manifest in the physical realm. Not just depression and anxiety, which are big, and addictions, which are big problems, compulsive behaviors, but cancer, autoimmune disorders, cardiovascular disease. These are things which kill people or debilitate them. And as the society slowly but surely, we hope, matures, the society will recognize that, and that the mind and the body are not separate, and that we learn that, and it's actually economically in our favor to have healthier people. And it's a small investment. Really, if you have the big picture, it's a small investment to help people with their mental health so they'll live healthier lives. So hopefully that'll come.
Yes.
I don't know when, but hopefully that'll come.
Well, no, good point. Actually, I'd say it's, I don't want to get into another topic at this point, but I agree completely. It's been one of the great weaknesses, maybe even the great weakness of the Western medical model, is its reductionist view of physical as physical, so to speak, whereas indigenous peoples from many parts of the world have understood the soul connection to physical illness and so on. Anyway, again, chrisbecker.org if you want to follow up on any of this. And the book is called Healing with Psychedelics. So I hope people find some use out of this, Chris, and I'll say thank you.
Thank you too, Stephen.